Welcome to a DYC Fire Chat. I'm Barrett Brode, Executive Assistant with the Democratic Youth Coalition.
And I'm Aurora Padilla. I work with the operational staff at the Democratic Youth Coalition.
And today we have Senator Faith Winter. Thank you for joining us, Senator.
Thanks for having me. I'm sorry that we had some technology and time confusion issues, but I'm so excited to be here with you all and learn more about your work and how we can work together.
Do you mind introducing yourself and how you got into politics?
Absolutely. So my name is Faith Winter. I'm a state senator in Westminster, Colorado. And really, there's two major stories that led to me being involved in politics. And the first is when I was a senior in college, I worked at a homeless shelter. And my job primarily was to find my clients, who were amazing people. Most of them were single women who many of them had children. They worked 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs. And my job was to help them find a place to live. And I would go from apartment complex to apartment complex and landlord to landlord, explaining why these women would be good community members. They'd pay their rent on time. They'd be responsible. And I heard no over and over and over again that they couldn't live there. And primarily it was because they didn't make 3 times the rent, which is a standard procedure in trying to find an affordable place to live. And so one day it was 104 degrees out. I had a very small car with no air conditioning. I was driving one of my very favorite clients to her job. She worked at Walmart. And you could only be at my homeless shelter for 3 months. Her 3-year-old boy was in the back of the car. And all her belongings were in 2 trash bags, black trash bags in my trunk. And I took her to her job. And I dropped her off at Walmart. And her son hid in the dressing room that day. And she had all her belongings in her break room. And I don't know where they slept that night because I couldn't convince a landlord or apartment complex that she was a responsible tenant, even though I knew she was. And that's when I realized that even though I really valued service work and still value service work, my sister still works in a homeless shelter, I wanted to change the system. I wanted to do systemic change, and my service work was a temporary band-aid to a really broken system. And I became a community organizer. And ever since that day, regardless of my title, and I was a city councilor, mayor pro tem, state representative, state senator. I've been an executive director of nonprofits, a lobbyist, a policy director, but those titles don't mean anything to me. What I am is an organizer, which means I bring people together every single day to build power and build power through community. And so I became a community organizer and started organizing college students actually all over Colorado to work on clean energy issues. And I'd bring them to the Capitol. And that's when I met Joan Fitzgerald, who was the first woman president of the Senate. And at that time, she was just my mentor. She was a rock star to me. And I asked her how she was so good at her job. And I was 25 at the time. And she said, well, we're only as good as the people we bring and the teams we build, and we need better people to run for office. And you should run. And 2 years later, I ran. When I was first elected to city council, I was the youngest elected woman in the state. Now I've trained many other women that are much younger to run than me, because I have taken that invitation that Joan gave me and tried to issue it to thousands of other people all over the country. And so it's really those two instances where I realized I want to do systemic change. And then it took someone believing in me and seeing me and saying, I believe in your leadership. And that's how I ended up in political office.
Oh, thank you for sharing that with us. We were also hoping to ask you a few questions about your work so far, if that's
okay. Yeah, anything's on the table. Feel free to ask me anything.
We're wondering, what are some steps you hope to take to ensure equal education opportunities for all children and youth throughout Colorado, or some reforms you hope to see?
So equal education, one of the things that I'm really proud of working on is there's a provision called Title IX, which is, everyone thinks it's only higher education, but it's actually throughout the whole K-12 school system. And this provides equal access to women and girls to the education system. And under the last administration, there was severe rollbacks on Title IX protections. So there wasn't protections for women being harassed or raped or sexually assaulted. And I passed a bill to make sure that we in Colorado have some of the strongest Title IX protections in the country, which is making sure that when a girl or a woman shows up for education, she has equal access because she's not being sexually harassed or assaulted, which is a really important step forward. And then obviously there's funding. And so the biggest bill I'm running this year is a transportation funding bill, which on its face doesn't sound like an education bill, but in Colorado for the past 2 decades, every single year we've talked about funding. It's been a fight between do we fund education or do we fund roads and bridges? And both are incredibly important. We need both for our economy, we need both for our quality of life. And so we are getting ready to pass a transportation funding bill, but what that's going to do is take off that fight from do we fund education or do we fund transportation? Because we're figuring out a mechanism over here to fund transportation, which is going to free up some more general fund for education. And that's really, really important. And then we've done a lot of work to make sure that when you are accessing school, you're doing it in an accessible and culturally appropriate way, right? So how are we making sure that we're teaching everyone history that doesn't just favor and show white people, right? How do we actually show the contributions of indigenous folks and people of color, and how do we tell the history in a real way? So those are some of the things I've worked on to make sure that we have access to education, it's a quality education, and that we're funding education in the right way and at the appropriate level.
Thanks. And what are some reforms you wish to see implemented to help build Colorado's renewable energy economy?
I'm the sponsor of Senate Bill 200, which is been threatened to be vetoed by the governor at this point in time. And I ran and was a sponsor 1261 in 2019. So in 2019, we ran 1261, which set some carbon reduction goals based on science. So this is based on how we maintain less than a 2-degree heat rise across the world. And that's a 26% reduction by 2025, a 50% reduction by 2030, and a 90% reduction by 2050. We have to meet these goals based on science. I was an environmental management major. I have a bachelor's of science. I am a scientist. I obviously don't do that day in, day out, but I understand science. And we didn't just pick these goals out of anywhere. These were goals that were based on science. And we established those goals in 2019. We are not on track to meet those goals right now. And so we introduced Senate Bill 200, which I'm currently negotiating on and hope to get something passed to make sure we are codifying and putting into statute our carbon reduction goals, because we cannot afford to meet these goals. If we miss these goals, people are literally going to die. We know that people in disproportionately impacted communities have taken on the burden from pollution for decades and centuries, and that impacts their health, it impacts their children, and climate is important to all of us. We had the worst fire season last year that we've ever seen. That impacts our agricultural industry, what you can grow and when you can grow it. It impacts our tourism industry, how many ski days there are. It impacts our health and our quality of life. And to keep Colorado strong, and the reason we all want to live here, we have to meet our climate goals right now.
And how do you plan on protecting or preserving public lands throughout Colorado? Do you have a specific plan you are hoping to use?
Yes. So this was a really good week for public lands. Well, 2 weeks ago was Public Lands Day, so I hope you all got out on, I think it was May 13th this year, but and celebrated our public lands. Every single year I've been in the legislature, I have run a conservation easements bill. So a conservation easement is when the owner of that land protects their land in perpetuity for conservation. And each conservation easement's a little different. So a lot of them are farmers and ranchers that want to maintain their land and their family and continue to farm and ranch, which leads to better air quality, carbon sequestration, wildlife habitat, wildlife corridors. Some conservation easements are all about wildlife. Some are about recreation. Some are about watershed protection. But we have preserved and saved millions of acres of lands all over the state through conservation easements. However, when we first started this program in 2000, we didn't have the best parameters around it. And so in the 2000s, there was some landowners that were harmed. Their land was valued higher than it should have been, and they made financial decisions and future family decisions based on that. And we have to correct for that if we're going to save this program. And so last week I passed Senate Bill 33, which makes landowners whole to ensure the success and forward-looking ability of conservation easements to move forward. And then I'm also working on House Bill 1233, which makes sure that we can use conservation easements to protect watersheds and water, and also take care of orphaned easements. So when the landowner is no longer responsible for it, but there's an easement on it, how do we keep it conserved? And so conservation easements is one of the major things I've done. Obviously, we need to protect our public lands. I've worked on federal wilderness bills as an organizer. I've worked to expand state parks as a state representative and state senator. And so it's one of the things that makes our state great and we'll continue to fight for.
What are some steps you plan to take to improve public health?
So there's a couple different things. When you say public health, I think we really have to make sure we're taking into account mental health as part of public health. And so making sure that we are providing the funding, the resources, the insurance coverage to cover mental health. Because during this last year, we've seen an increase in suicides, we've seen an increase in opioid abuse, we've seen an increase in drug and alcohol abuse, and making sure that everyone has easy access to mental health care, and also reducing that stigma, and making sure that when they do access that health care, that these professionals are well trained and ready to give them health care. So I've worked with my best friend, Sarah Brittany Pedersen. It's important to have friends when you do this work. And so as in her wedding, I was her bridesmaid. We work together all the time, but she's really led on the mental health and addiction crisis. And we are getting ready to pass a bill that's going to allocate $100 million of federal stimulus money to make sure we're taking care of mental health, which is really important. In addition to that, I have spent the majority of my career working for paid family and medical leave, which is a healthcare issue, because we've seen time and time again people that skip their second round of chemotherapy. They're not able to be there with their children when they're going through a health crisis. And we know if there's a parent in a hospital with a child, they are likely to leave the hospital earlier with better outcomes. When you have paid family and medical leave, you can take care of an elderly parent who needs health care. And so I ran that bill 5 times unsuccessfully, and then worked really hard to make sure that we passed it at the ballot last year through ballot initiative 118. And I'm working on the implementation of that now. And I think that's going to have a really significant impact on our healthcare system.
And what is your stance on increasing paid maternity leave, as well as creating more comfortable circumstances for mothers returning to work?
Yeah, so that's paid family and medical leave, which is 118, which I've been a leader on both here in Colorado and nationally. But I think it's really important to really focus it as paid family and medical leave, because it is important for mothers and their children, and having the ability to bond, the ability to breastfeed. Both of my pregnancies, I have 2 children. I was on bed rest each time and ran out of leave and had to go back to work pretty early. But it's also not just moms and infants, right? It's the cancer patient that needs to be able to go to their cancer treatment. It's my dad is currently in the hospital with a blood infection, and it's being able to take care of my dad. as he's in the hospital. And my sister's been able to take some paid leave off recently in order to take care of him. So, and most of the folks that do take advantage of paid family and medical leave, it's for their own self-care. So when they have surgery, when they have a hip replacement, when they have cancer, when they have a heart attack. And so it's something that I've championed here locally and championed nationally and continue to work on with the Biden administration.
What is your stance on creating more affordable housing throughout your community?
As I shared my story earlier about why I ran, it really was to create more affordable housing. So I've been a city councilor and I worked really hard to increase the amount of affordable housing we had in Westminster. And while I was on city council, was nearly able to double the amount of affordable housing we have. Last year, we passed Amendment 77, which was the tobacco tax increase, which was mostly about preschool. But before I voted for it, I made sure that we were spending $30 million of that on affordable housing, because you can't just have a child in preschool and expect them to be successful if they don't have a safe roof over their head. I often say that we need children to be more worried about the homework in their backpack than where they're going to sleep at night. And that means we need to have an affordable housing infrastructure. As we look at the federal stimulus money coming to Colorado, the state house and the state senate will work together over the summer to make some transformative decisions on how we set up sustainable, long-lasting, affordable housing solutions in Colorado, because we are at a crisis and we have to work on that right now.
And what is your stance on increasing school funds and teacher pay?
So in Colorado, we are one of the very few states, if not the only state, that does not outline teacher pay in the legislature. So you've seen all across the country, teachers show up and they come to the Capitol, they wear red for ed. I wear red for ed every day that it happens in Colorado. But we are a very local control state. So we cannot dictate teacher pay at the state level. That is for the school boards. However, we need to make sure we're adequately funding our schools so our school boards can increase teacher pay. And as I said earlier, that's one of the reasons I worked on transportation. So we could find a different revenue fund for transportation and protect more money for education, which also goes to teacher pay. We're also creating a special fund at the state level to increase teacher pay. And Colorado is near the bottom of the list in funding our education system. And we have to fund our education system better. But the tools that we have as a legislature are pretty limited. So when you look at Colorado, we have to talk about TABOR when we talk about all these funding issues, which is the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. So in other states, the legislature often makes the tough decision to increase taxes in a mild way, in an acceptable way, in a way that is comfortable. But Colorado is near the bottom of the tax structure in property tax, in income tax. But as a legislator, I can't make that decision. Only the voters of Colorado have. And unfortunately, the voters of Colorado have rejected several ballot initiatives asking to increase education funding. And so we can free up as much general fund as possible, but at some point, the voters are going to have to participate in this process.
You kind of touched on this earlier, but however, what is your stance on creating a more accessible reproductive health care for women?
We need to make sure that everyone has access to basic healthcare, which includes reproductive healthcare. And so, for example, we passed a bill this year that allows undocumented folks more access to reproductive healthcare. Funding our reproductive healthcare service centers is essential in providing healthcare, and it's something that I've worked on for a long time.
And, what is your stance on offering paid internships?
So I think we should absolutely have paid internships, because you shouldn't be because if we don't have paid internships, it's just accessible to those that can be provided for by their families. And that creates an equity issue. So one of the things I'm working on really hard at the state capitol is making sure that we have aides that are year round and paid as professionals. Right now, they're paid minimum wage, almost a little bit more. They're part time, they don't work year round. We just provided healthcare for them. Um, I ran the most competitive Senate race in the entire country last cycle. So the DLCC and the RLCC listed my race as the most important race in the country. And I made sure that we were providing the folks that worked on my campaign. They worked 32 hours. They made well above minimum wage. When they decided in the last 4 weeks of the campaign to work more, they were paid time and a half. They had paid family and medical leave. They had sick days. We had a workplace harassment policy. And so this idea that to be a progressive and work in the progressive movement, that you have to give of yourself 80 hours a week or you're just not passionate enough. And to give 80 hours a week to a nonprofit or a campaign or to be an aide or an unpaid intern, or you're just not bought into the movement is something that I'm working very, very diligently to change, because we can't be the party that promotes an increased minimum wage. We can't be the party that promotes universal health care. We can't be the party that promotes wage protection and then not practice it in our day-to-day jobs.
What is your stance on disability accessibility and inclusiveness?
You broke up a little. Disability, accessibility, and
Inclusiveness, sorry.
inclusiveness. So I love the Colorado Cross Disability Coalition, and their tagline is "Nothing about us without us." And they are a key partner in a lot of legislation I run, in making sure that we are being inclusive with that community, making sure that we are basing the laws we're writing with their input. Right. And so including them is incredibly important. And it's one of the things that I've really worked hard on within the transportation sector. So when you think about transportation, many people think a good public transit system is a nice to have, not a must to have thing. But when you're part of the disability community, sometimes it's a must to have. It's how you get to work, it's how you get to the doctors, it's how you get to the grocery store. And so when we're looking at expanding our public transit, we have to do that in a way that's inclusive and makes sure that we are including our disability community.
And how do you hope to ensure that all workers feel safe in their workplace and around others?
This is very, very, very close to me. So I came out against my sexual harasser in November of 2017. He was a fellow Democratic legislator. And the only reason I came forward with my story is I found out he was harassing other women in the workplace. And so when he first harassed me, I went to leadership right away. He apologized and said he would get counseling and stop drinking, etc. And I said, that's fine, but I need to know that's not happening to anyone else. In November 2017, a reporter called me, and this was in the middle of the Me Too movement when it was first breaking, and said, I think you should know that this representative has 11 other people that he's harassed, and some as recently as July and August. And I was a privileged white woman with power. I had a title, I was elected, and I felt I had to come forward to make sure it didn't happen again. I went through 5 months of retaliation. He was in the media daily, taking apart my credibility. He wrote a manifesto against me and the other women that came forward. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. And we ended up expelling him. It was the first time we expelled anyone in the Colorado legislature in 103 years. So that's a once in a lifetime something that happens. But keeping women in the capital safe wasn't enough. And so since then, I made sure we updated our capital policies to protect women, because access to democracy and making sure our aides and our interns and our lobbyists feel like they can access that building is really important. And then I passed a Title IX bill, which I mentioned, which is protecting women in education institutions in every single university across the state, to make sure that we are reducing harassment and rape on campus. And when harassment and rape on campus happens, that we treat the survivors fairly. And just this week, I passed through the Senate with bipartisan support, Senate Bill 176, which is updating our harassment policies for the state of Colorado. Because currently in law, the standard for harassment in the workplace is severe and pervasive. Oftentimes judges have said that means there's one free grope, because that's not pervasive, right? Or you can be continually texted by a superior harassing you, but that's not severe. And so we had account after account after account of racial discrimination, LGBTQ discrimination, sexual harassment, and even sexual assault that did not meet that standard. And so this week in the Senate, we passed a law to update the standard to a standard that acknowledges that harassment and discrimination in the workplace is unacceptable. And everyone in Colorado should expect to show up to work and be treated fairly and with respect. And we're going to have workplaces do trainings now. We're going to let people know who they report to if they get harassed or discriminated against. And it's a huge step forward. And it was a surprise, a very happy surprise, that we passed it out of the Senate with bipartisan support.
Thank you for sharing that. What is your stance on creating more local jobs?
More local jobs?
Yeah.
Colorado has a really great economy, and we're bouncing back more than anyone else. So, not more than anyone else, but in a very strong way. I have sponsored 4 different bills to help small businesses retain their employees during COVID. That's totaled over $100 million to help small businesses. I also work frequently in the renewable energy and energy efficiency area, which creates a lot of jobs. But we have to make sure these jobs are good jobs, right? So it's not just job creation. If it's a job that pays minimum wage without health benefits and without wage protection and with scheduling complications, and so we have to make sure the jobs are good. And when we talk about the renewable energy industry, and we are going through a transition, we are transitioning away from coal jobs. That means that we are transitioning away from coal miners and people that work at coal plants, and we're shutting down coal-fired plants. And so one of the bills I'm most proud to have passed is the Just Transition Bill, which is an office in Colorado, because even though the energy efficiency industry has 80,000 jobs and many of them are really good paying, there's still a coal miner in Craig that's being impacted, and we need to take care of that coal miner in Craig. And we need to do that. We need to do it based on the community and what the right community solution is. It's not my job as a senator from Westminster to tell that coal miner from Craig what to do. And so creating the Office of Just Transition and making sure we fund it is really important as well when we look at jobs.
Thank you. That's about all the questions we have for tonight. But thank you so much for coming here and sharing your story with us, as well as your reforms changes you have done or hope to see in the future.
Yeah.
And once again, we apologize for the bit of a mess up at the beginning here, but thank you.
No, it was my mess up too. So I appreciate all you. I appreciate the work you're doing. And thank you so much.
Thank you.